So last time we left off with this argument from common practice. And let me back up to remind us what we're all talking about. In this chapter, we're looking at rhetorical devices that are used to persuade people in the absence of logic. And this is a way you can use words, you can structure sentences to slant people toward your position without using logic on your side. So we're trying to become more familiar with these forms of argument, or these fallacies, these rhetorical maneuvers, so that we can make sure we don't allow them to influence us as we analyze the logic of an argument. Now, along with that, I should add a qualification, I guess. And that is that when we are developing an argument for a particular audience, we should use rhetoric to improve the persuasiveness of our argument. And specifically in rhetoric, we talk about familiarizing yourself with your audience and using vocabulary with which they would be familiar and accepting. And so in order to be persuasive, you're going to have to both use logic and rhetoric. So you're going to have to bring these together at some point. But the point of these chapters in this class on logic is to help you become more familiar with rhetorical devices so that you can distinguish them from your analysis of the logic of an argument. But I say this because when you do have to write papers for a class or you have to give a presentation to a group, you're going to have to put both these together, logic and rhetoric, to be really effective. All right? Now, the argument from common practice, this is a fallacy, and it essentially refers to when we try to justify and defend one of our actions on the grounds that it is common. Everybody does it, so I should be able to do it. This is not a valid argument. Just because a lot of people speed does not mean that you should not get a ticket if you do it. And so the argument from common practice is going to be, oh, I shouldn't be blamed because everybody does this. Can you think of another example of the argument from common practice? Another example of the argument from common practice. Yes, sir.
I'm just trying to be like everybody else. Everyone's doing like a party. Say a mother tells daughter not to drink.
Yes. Everybody's drinking at the party, Mom. Therefore, I should be able to drink. Absolutely. Absolutely. Argument from common practice. Everybody cheats on their taxes. Therefore, I should be able to get away with it. Don't try that argument. The IRS will not be accepted. A similar argument is the argument from tradition. This is justifying or defending an action or practice on the grounds that it is part of a tradition. Part of a tradition. A lot of people had a tradition of being discriminatory, discriminating against certain groups. Did you hear the name of the ranch that Rick Perry went to? I can't even say it in class. He had a tradition of had the N-word in the title of the ranch where they stayed. It's pretty amazing. On the basis of tradition, a lot of groups have done a lot of really stupid and offensive things. And just because it's part of your tradition does not make it acceptable. It's a form of the argument from common practice. Santa Claus does not exist. Any questions about the argument from common practice or the argument from tradition? Fairly easy. You hear this from your mom. If a bunch of your friends were jumping off the bridge, would you go do it? No, of course not. That's stupid. So, moving on to the subjectivist fallacy. The subjectivist fallacy is the idea that something is true just because one thinks that it is. Now, kind of hard-pressed to find some examples here, and they have a kind of abstract one. If someone were to say that sandpaper is slippery, we would say that this person doesn't understand the meaning of the words used. Because sandpaper by definition, is not slippery. And if you think it is, you're misunderstanding the words in the sentence. So this example is supposed to illustrate that our beliefs are not completely subjective. Just because you think something is the case does not make it true. And you could think this is the case as long as you want, but it's never going to be true. Sandpaper is not slippery. So it's a fallacy just to think that something is true because you believe it. Do you know anybody who would offer an argument like that? I guess you'd have to be really egotistical. I know everything, and I think this is true. Therefore, it is true. This is a pretty weird one, the relativist fallacy. And the example they give, I don't know if I interpret it the same way as the authors of the text do. Nonetheless, it's fairly easy to understand this fallacy. The relativist fallacy is when people believe the standards of their culture are universal. They apply everywhere. And they also believe the standards of other cultures are relative to the culture that you're living in. So this person is adopting a different standard to his own culture's values than he uses when he applies to other cultures' values. For example, well, I think bullfighting is wrong, but other cultures don't think so. And who am I to tell them what to believe? If they think there is nothing wrong with bullfighting, then I guess it's wrong for them to have bullfights. Now, what the authors tell us is that you can think your culture's view is correct. You can think that. Or you can think that the issue is relative to the culture that you're in. You can think either of those two things. What you can't do is think both of them at the same time. If you think your culture's values are universal, you can't go then and say that the values of that culture are going to be relative to the culture. You can't apply different standards to different groups. So you can either think that all values are relative to the culture that they're in, or you need to think that all values can be absolutely correct in some sense, but you can't think both at the same time. Any questions with that fallacy? It's a little weird. A little weird. And I don't see it being adopted in this passage, to be honest with you. I think that this person could be suggesting that the values of his or her own culture are also relative. I'm not sure that they're making that universalist claim. But let me just summarize what the fallacy is. If you assume that the values of your culture are universal, and you assume that the values of other cultures are relative to the culture that you're in, then you're engaged in this relativist fallacy. You can't think both of those at the same time. You gotta pick one or the other. Yes, ma'am?
So you will have to think that both are relative, both values in different cultures?
You need to think either one of these. Either that values are going to be universal, and that's the case in all cultures, or you need to think that values are relative, and that's the case in all cultures. But you can't think both, one with respect to your culture and other with respect to these other cultures. So there's two choices here. You can think your culture's view is correct, and you can think that that is a universal truth that applies in all cultures. Or you can think that all values are going to be relative to the culture that you're in. But you can't think that both at the same time. You can't assume that your values are universal, but theirs are relative. Yes, ma'am?
When you say values, do you mean like
Moral
deep
values.
cultural things, or just like, okay, like for example, in a lot of European countries, when they go to restaurants, they don't tip their servers. That's just like not how they do it. So if they came to America and they didn't do that, would that be an example of that?
You know, that's why they're so rude over there. They never get tipped. That could be an example of cultural relativism, where the behavior with respect to treating your waiter is going to vary with respect to the culture that you're in.
Okay.
Now, the relativist fallacy would be to assume that, well, in our country, we tip our waiters, and therefore, it's universally true in all countries at all times that you ought to tip your waiters. But then you also believe that, well, when you're in France, they don't want you to tip the waiters. And, you know, it's their culture, so they can make the call. Well, you can't do both of those. You can't say that their values are relative and assume that your values are universal. And that's where you get to this fallacy. Have you been to France?
Yes.
No kidding. Are they rude?
I mean, I don't speak French, so I don't.
And then if you try, they don't put up with that at all. They don't. Parlez-vous français? No. France. How long were you there?
Not very long. Well, I was in Spain. We just kind of went to France for the day, but it was cool.
Yes, yes, it is very cool. All right, here's one I shouldn't have to tell you, I suppose. Two wrongs do not make a right. Two wrongs do not make a right in life or in argumentation. So let's say your upstairs neighbors stay up real late, stomping around, making a bunch of noise. That does not mean that you're justified running their car into the river. They were up all night, man. I have to get up in the morning. Therefore, you know, I threw their car in the river. No, you know, that's not justified. Just because somebody did something wrong doesn't mean that you have the right to do something wrong back to them. The wrongful behavior of the neighbors does not change the status of your wrongful behavior. It's still wrong. And if you use this kind of reasoning in an argument, you engage in a fallacy. It's a fallacy to argue this way. Now, if, you know, your neighbors have stomped around and made noise late at night, repeatedly, and this is now the 30th day in a row that it's taken place, and the police have come back on several occasions to warn them and to advise them and blah, 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 and they still have not done anything. Well, the police will be justified in writing a ticket and maybe forcing them to pay a fine. And therefore, these people, if they do a wrong, they can be punished for that wrong. And that's what we call retributivism. That's where somebody does something wrong, and then in order to equal the scales of justice, we need to have them punished in some way. And that's going to be justified. But that's going to be different from you just taking out your frustration by running their car into the river. Two wrongs do not make a right. And this would be a fallacy. Now, think about this idea in the context of our dropping of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And here, this effort was seen as a form of self-protection. Why was the dropping of these bombs seen as a form of self-protection? Well before your time. Caleb.
I suppose they thought that resistance fighters in Japan hold up in the mountains for 10 years and countless legions of people would be killed over time.
They were training the kids in elementary school how to hold weapons in Japan. And the idea was that they were going to fight to the bitter end. And if that were the case, we'd lose tens of thousands of more people on both sides. So we dropped these weapons on these countries, on these cities, in order to bring the war to an abrupt end now. And it wouldn't end 5 years later. And the idea is that although this is horrific and many died as a result of these bombs, you could see it in calculation of the future as actually saving lives. And that's why it was done. So they don't consider this to be a version of two wrongs make a right. The authors describe this as a form of self-protection. And they did attack us at Pearl Harbor. Yes, sir.
Arguably, the quid pro quo attack for Pearl Harbor was the firebombing of Tokyo by Doolittle and his guys. That was, let's go get them because they got us. And they, instead of attacking a military base like Pearl Harbor was, they attacked civilians and killed thousands of civilians.
And not only in
They knew that.
Tokyo,
Paper houses.
firebombing cities all across Japan. Tens, 20,000 people in each city died of these firebombs. So you're absolutely right. The people in Japan had to pay dearly for the war effort.
Which was, sorry, do you know which was first, Hiroshima?
I believe Hiroshima was first. I'm not sure.
So Nagasaki was redundant, because we didn't give them enough time to even figure out what happened.
Nagasaki was intended to show that Hiroshima was not an accident. We can't do it again.
If you think that would be inferred.
Not when this is the first one dropped, you know. This is the first time it ever occurred, and you know, showing that you can control it, I think might be significant. But you know, I'm not going to lay my money on either side of that. It's a tough call, definitely. But for the point of our discussion today, this is to show that there are cases where somebody does a wrong and they have to be punished, or something else is done to bring violence to an end, and that does not qualify as this fallacy of two wrongs make a right. Sometimes we need to protect ourselves. Sometimes we need to punish those who are guilty, and those would be different cases. So this fallacy of two wrongs do not make a right is going to apply in these cases where somebody does something to you and you just think of something to do better. That would be what we want to avoid.
If you do the same that the person did to you, they make noise, you make noise.
I think that might be justifiable, but not advisable.
Yeah.
That's not the way to deal with that. I've done that before. When I was living on Miami Beach, I had this guy living next door, and I like reggae music, but not that loud and right in my face. And briefly, I thought of kind of competing with stereos. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. Now, another fallacy, perhaps more common, and in these debates and political discussions, you might see people using what they call a red herring, or a smoke screen. These are two ways of referring to this fallacy. A red herring is when a person brings a topic into a conversation that distracts from the original point. And that's the whole idea, is that you bring this other issue and it distracts people from the real discussion. Maybe you have a weakness in the discussion of this issue. So you're going to bring this red herring in to get people off topic, to try to cover a weakness on your part.
They do that all the time in trials.
Yeah. Trials, political debates.
Yeah. African politician.
Yeah, that's their middle name.
Yeah.
My middle name's Red Herring. And the idea comes that if you actually drag a herring across a trail, a dog will leave the original trail and go along with the red herring. And that's where the term comes from. You want to get a dog off the trail, you drag the red herring across there, get the dog going that way. Because if you go that way, they'll find the dead body. Don't want that. So you want to distract people by using the red herring. For example, President Clinton fired missiles at terrorists in the Sudan during the Monica Lewinsky affair hearings. A lot of people thought this was a desperate red herring. Here they're looking at my possible marital infidelity. They're thinking of impeaching me as the president. Can you believe that? They were thinking of impeaching him for that. And so to get people off the topic, boom, I'm bombing Sudan. Oh my gosh, on the news today, bombing Sudan. Here's what we're doing in Sudan, blah, blah, blah. And you get people talking about something other than Monica Lewinsky. Was that a red herring? I wouldn't put it past it. And I don't do that to you in my class. You know, when you do bad on a test, I don't make you sick. President Bush, his description of Iraq as possessing weapons of mass destruction and being 6 months away from a nuclear capability distracted us from the real reason for the war. This is the authors, I should tell you. Oil. So we get people thinking, oh, weapons of mass destruction, and I think they sold something to people in Niger, blah, blah, blah. And you get people not thinking about the fact they have boatloads of oil and we need it. You could perhaps see these as examples of a red herring. Anybody have any better examples of the use of the red herring?
Like, it's been known that America uses reasons or to get into wars or invade. Like in World War I, it was the sinking of the Lusitania, and there are some schools of thought that say we kind of irked the German submarines to attack. Like there were warnings that you shouldn't come into our waters, and we did anyways. And it's like, oh, then it was on every major newspaper and got people fired up and got to get into the war.
Some have made the same argument with respect to World War II,
Yeah.
that Franklin Delano Roosevelt really wanted to get into the war to protect the English, but the people weren't on that side. So you take an aggressive stand relative to Japan, knowing that they would eventually strike back,
Yeah.
and then when they do, then we can get into all the
It's
wars.
happened with everyone, and a lot of people think 9/11.
Gulf of Tonkin and
Yeah,
Vietnam.
Vietnam, Gulf of Tonkin. 9/11, a lot of people think it was growing that it was a big hoax just to get us into the war.
So this might actually be like a systematic tool used by our government to get people accepting of all these wars.
And Napoleon started that thing. He would like get the people like send the troops into like a known like suicide mission. He would know that they were like half of them were gonna die. Like, oh look, our people are dead. And France would get fired up and was like, all right, we got your back. You know.
Pretty sick. Smoke screens and red herrings appear to be popular tools used by governments. So we should be wary. Yes, sir.
Forget, what was the pretense that Hitler used to invade Poland? Didn't he like dress up a bunch of corpses in like Polish uniforms or something? Like,
Well, no, there was a building blown up in Germany. One of their parts of their government, and he blamed it on enemies. And that was a perfect red herring. He got the whole country fired up. And some believe that he had that building intentionally bombed in order to have that excuse. So this is a popular tool used by governments. Be wary. When you hear something that could be used as a red herring, you might look for what the real issue is at stake.
Even like the Iliad, invading Troy, the guy used the jacking of one dude stole some guy's wife. Remember the movie?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
he's like, oh, let's use that to.
Yeah, we've been using red herrings a long,
Yeah.
long time. Absolutely. A tool that we have often used. Hey, why don't you turn this off there?
Just press the red button.
The red button.